Putin recognizes that he doesn't have enough recruits to replace the losses in Ukraine and perform other missions that they still attend to around the world. But most significantly, it's about, again, having the additional forces that are needed in Ukraine, where they've taken very, very heavy losses. They have, for a period of time, they were losing more each day, and these are actual losses, not just wounded, than we lost in an entire month in the worst year of the surge in Iraq. So he has a real challenge on his hand, but without mobilizing the country for war, which he does not want to do because of concern over domestic issues associated with that. He's trying to do this in a way that skirts that, still calls this a special operation, but still provides the forces needed. And I think many observers that focus on this intently believe that this is much more aspirational than it is going to be realistic. He will not be able to raise the additional forces. He's actually struggling now just with the recruits to bring them in, again, to replace the losses that they're having on the battlefield. And of course, at this moment, Russia has achieved nothing like what I'm sure Putin and his generals expected they would have achieved. Of course, they didn't achieve their main objective, which was to take Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and topple the government, replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. They had to withdraw from there and two other major northern cities. They weren't able to take Kharkiv, the number 2 city in Ukraine, very close to the border. Those forces have been pushed back out of artillery range of the city. They did expand their holdings in the southeast and the south, but now they're really grinding to a halt in their efforts to expand on those. So Russia's in a tough position. And meanwhile, you have Ukraine, which is supported not just by the arsenal of democracy, the United States, with another $3 billion worth of assistance just the other day, taking this up to well over $13 billion just since January of 2021. Yeah, but they're also supported by all the other NATO countries and most other Western countries around the world as well. And so that's very important because you do have on the battlefield a war of attrition, if you will, but there's another war or competition that's ongoing, and that's the forced generation competition. And in this regard, Ukraine is much more impressive and effective and efficient in recruiting, training, organizing, equipping, and employing new forces and capabilities than is Russia. And in fact, they've been using some of the systems that we've provided very effectively, these precise rockets and precise artillery rounds, to take out the Russian ammo supply points, the Russian fuel depots, Russian headquarters, Russian assembly areas, and even the Russian airfields in the Crimean Peninsula. So nowhere now is really safe for the Russians on territory that once was Ukrainian, and they're having to withdraw some of their assets all the way back to Russia proper. What that means is that it's much more challenging for Russia now to logistically support their troops on the front line as Ukraine is trying to isolate those, particularly those that are just west of the Dnipro River in the southern part of the country around the city of Kherson, Kherson, where we expect to see at some point a counteroffensive launched by the Ukrainians.
Let's keep in mind as well, though, that just the cost-benefit analysis here for Vladimir Putin, who, of course, is in an incredibly desperate situation. And we can talk about that in a moment. But to use tactical nuclear weapons would actually not reverse Russia's fortunes on the battlefield. It would be very destructive, very lethal in a specific area on that battlefield. But it would not reverse this reality that confronts Russia. And that is the real new development, I think, in Ukraine, which is demonstrated by the Ukrainian successful offensive. But what is behind that is the fact that the Ukrainians have decisively won the battle of force generation. In other words, from the very beginning, they mobilized completely. And now this country of less than a third the population of Russia has a much larger army in the field in Ukraine. It is vastly better equipped. Of course, $15.1 billion worth of military hardware and ammunition and assistance from the United States alone, and plenty more from our NATO allies and other Western countries throughout the world. And now they are bringing these new forces and capabilities to bear in a very effective manner on the battlefield. There's nothing that Russia can do to reverse this situation. None on the Ukrainian side, candidly. They are not going to acknowledge that this is part of Russia any more than they'll acknowledge that that what was seized back in 2014 is part of Russia. And indeed, of course, they've conducted strikes and operations against Russian forces in Crimea, and there was no discernible response to that by Russia, as if it had been on their territory or something like that. The real issue here is, I think, that Putin wants to complete this in time for the fall conscript recruitment drive that goes on every year in Russia. And this will now be part of Russia, so now they can try to round up men of military age in these new, quote, Russian republics or whatever they will describe them as. Again, that's not going to produce capable, well-trained, well-equipped, organized forces. It'll create more bodies. But bodies aren't how you combat a force that is now shown to be as capable and as well-equipped and increasingly professional Ukrainian forces. Well, I think an area of real emphasis has to be additional air and ballistic missile defenses, because the one reality that is still very stark for Ukraine is that while Russia can no longer take appreciable territory and is likely to lose much, if not all, of what they have seized since 24 February, with tough fighting to be sure, what Russia can and is doing is to carry out essentially punishing strikes. They can punish Ukraine with missiles and rockets, and they have been doing that. And they're going after civilian infrastructure in particular, power generation, power transmission, even hospitals in some cases, water supplies, all of this to make life difficult, increasingly difficult for Ukrainian citizens in those areas that are within range of these different capabilities. And of course, Russia has some that are very, very long range. So that's the brutal reality for Ukraine and its leadership, just as Putin has to face this brutal reality that he's lost the fourth generation war, and the implications of that are that his forces are going to lose the vast majority, if not all, of what they have gained since 24 February. When that does take shape, I think another important element will be the NATO countries pledging to ensure the security of Ukraine, and perhaps actually inviting Ukraine to apply for membership in NATO. Well, what I would like to see first, frankly, is scour for every T-72, T-64, T-80 that might be in the arsenal